Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
I'd like to welcome you to the Does God Exist series of materials dealing with the existence of God. As a person who was an atheist for many years and as a person who has taught in the public schools for some 41 years, I have a different perspective on some of these things than probably a lot of other people do. But I think it's important to understand why we're trying to do this. I generally get two kinds of skeptical reactions to the sort of things we try to do. One is the atheist who says, "This is ridiculous. Nobody believes in God. Why should I waste my time looking at this kind of material?" And I think that's rooted to a great extent in the fact that there's been a lot of stupidity out there. There's been a lot of bad arguments made. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think there are some good arguments. And as a person who came to believe in God through my studies in science, I'd like to share with you some of the things that led me to move out of an atheistic orientation and into a believer one. For those of you who are perhaps already believers in God, there's another negative reaction that I sometimes get to these presentations, and that is, I believe in God. Why should I waste my time talking about this stuff? And I think there's two responses I'd like to make to that. The first one is, you need to know how to share your faith with others. And we live in a world where a lot of things are happening to cause people to have a lot of faith problems. And if we're to be ready to give an answer with the hope that is within us to every man, surely the question of how we know there's a God is part of that answer. But I think all of us have a problem with faith that reflects in how we act and what we do. I'd like to show you a little visual that I think represents the problems that we all have. We have a line here, sort of a sine wave line that goes up and down. And what that line represents is life. I don't know about you, but I have times when I have really good days. Man, everything's going great and I'm really on top of the world. And then there are those days when nothing goes right. And I really get pretty discouraged. I can become very, very negative about things. Life is highs and lows. And if you say, no, not me, I'm always just perfectly flat, I don't believe that. I think that people have hills and valleys. And in the Bible, for those of you who are believers, there's no question that the people who were instrumental in the establishment of the church and in following the teachings of Jesus had their highs and lows. I mean, look at Peter. One minute he's walking on the water, and the next minute it's, "Lord, save me." One minute it says, "I'll never deny you," and then the next minute the cock crows. Life is ups and downs, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a believer. And for people who are believers, there's a question of vulnerability. At the bottom of this visual, we have an area that is labeled unbelief level. We all have an unbelief level. In the Bible, we see people saying like, "Lord, help my unbelief." And I think it's important to understand that in today's world, there's lots of things that can push that unbelief level up, can increase it. Problems with a marriage, the death of somebody you love, the world situation, people doing stupid things that hurt you. Life has a tendency to produce unbelief in us. And for many people, that unbelief level has increased to such a point where it really saturates their life. And that's really the atheist view, that the area of unbelief is so large, there's so much evidence for it, that it has become their dominant faith. For those who are believers, there's a hope that we can push that unbelief level down. And I believe it's useful to look at a discussion like this with the idea of reducing our unbelief level, knowing how to answer the kinds of questions that would tend to produce unbelief. There's another perspective that I'd like to do as we introduce this series of videos, and that is that I think there's a mistaken concept of the relationship of faith and science, or how we view the Bible and science. And this visual sort of demonstrates what I think a lot of people believe. And I'm not restricting this to any particular group. I think you hear it from the pulpit. I think you see it in the media. And of course, there are atheists that would love to present this perspective, and that is that science and faith are antagonists, that they're on a collision course. There are popularizers of science who have essentially said, you have to decide whether you're to be a well-educated, logical, intelligent, thinking, scientific person, or whether you're going to be a believer in God. That these are opposing points of view. I think that's horribly destructive. As a teacher, I've had a lot of students over the years that struggle with this. I remember particularly one young man that I had in my class who was the son of a minister, and he was a terrific science student. He just had this tremendous natural ability to understand things scientifically, a tremendous mind with great quantitative analysis skills. And he was in getting some help one night on a problem in physics, and we worked through the problem, and then he saw it, and the little light came on, and he was, sort of enthusiastic. He said, man, I love this. I sure wish I could be a scientist. And I said, well, why can't you? I said, I would hope this would be your career. You're really good at this. He said, no. He said, I want to be a Christian. And you see, what had happened was that somehow along the line, he had gotten the idea that he had to make a choice. And as I say, that's a terribly destructive perspective. You see, what I would suggest to you is that science and faith, science and our understanding of what the Bible says, are symbiotic relationships. They reinforce each other. They support each other. They aren't enemies. And I hope if you got nothing else out of this series of videos that we're hoping to get you to look at, that you'll see that there is a tremendous support for belief in God from the field of science. It led me to become a Christian. And I hope whether you're an atheist, whether you're an agnostic, whether you're a believer, that you'll find some things here that will be helpful and useful to you. Now, I'm not a philosopher. Well, we're all philosophers in a sense, but that's not my field of expertise. And so I just want to make one sort of generalized philosophical perspective to get you to understand a little bit about where we're coming from. I'm making one assumption philosophically about the things that we're going to be talking about. And this is an assumption. I admit that. I won't debate it with you. I won't argue it with you. If you want to debate this, you have to argue it with somebody else. But now, before you get to feeling this is going to be some big, heavy, difficult subject, let me show you what it is. Yeah. I just want you to be willing to admit that you exist, that there is reality. Now, if you're watching this set of videos and if you don't believe you exist, you got bigger problems than I want to deal with. And I fully understand that there's a valid philosophical perspective to this question. I run into this all the time. We're doing a series of lectures in a college or a university, and almost always somebody will raise this question. Well, how do you know you exist? And I understand the philosophical perspective, but I suggest to you that's not the way we make decisions. If you're standing in the middle of a street and a cement truck is bearing down on you, you don't stand there pondering the reality of your existence. You get out of the road. That's a practical, pragmatic approach to major questions, and that's what I'm asking you to apply here. You say, well, you can't prove God exists. Well, that's true in an absolute sense. In an absolute sense, you can't prove you exist. You say, well, look at me. And I say, well, how do I know you're not just a fancy hologram? I mean, if you want to play those kinds of games, and I think they are games, they're mental games, that's not a negative. But if you want to play those kind of games, then you really can't prove your own existence. But again, I say to you, that's not the way we make decisions. So no, we're not talking absolute proof here. What we're talking about is the weight of the evidence. And what I'd like to do is to show you a logical approach that I believe can be used in dealing with this question of how we know there's a God, what the evidence is. And this isn't going to be a biblical argument. It's not going to be a heavy philosophical approach. It's not going to be a major theological approach, although all of those